Professor Fischer is Assistant Professor of Gender History at the University of Texas at Dallas. And today she will talk about her new book called The Streets Belong to Us: Sex, Race, and Police Power from Segregation to Gentrification, which was published in the Justice, Power, and Politics series by the University of North Carolina Press in 2022. Her research on gender, race, and law enforcement has been published in the Journal of American History and the Journal of Social History, as well as popular outlets, including the Washington Post and the Boston Review. And she's also a Brown graduate, PhD in history in 2018. We decided that's called BC, before COVID, and it feels like forever ago, but it's wonderful to have you back, Anne. Thanks so much for joining us here at CSREA.
Thank you so much, Trisha. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to go ahead and start showing some slides. I'm going to try to do this as seamlessly as possible. So while I'm doing this, I want to just extend my great thanks to Trisha, Stephanie LaRue, Ellie Winter, Maggie Murphy, and all the amazing folks at the CSREA. This is such a lovely homecoming, and it's really joyful for me to be here. And many thanks to the folks who are tuning in. I also want to name that while I'm sharing these visuals, you can go ahead and take me on the road, take me for a walk. If there's any citations you need from the talk, I'd be happy to share them afterwards. Because I know that we are all over-screened, particularly at this point in the very long semester. Before I start, I also want to name that this talk involves discussions of racialized and gendered state violence, so please take care of yourself. 15 years ago, I was working at a labor union local in Boston, and my boss had this framed poster on his wall for a fundraiser for PUMA, the Prostitutes Union of Massachusetts. I didn't know at the time that PUMA was part of a larger movement in the 1970s and the 1980s for what was called the Prostitutes' Rights Movement. But I was really struck by the idea of a group of criminalized women organizing to make political demands. So I became obsessed with this history. I was a regular at the Schlesinger Library in Radcliffe. And miraculously, the leaders of PUMA were my neighbors in Boston. So they opened up their garages and their filing cabinets to me, helping to create what Kelly Lytle Hernandez calls a rebel archive of the sex workers' rights movement. It was around this time that a mentor suggested I consider a PhD in history. I didn't know anyone who had gotten a PhD or what that meant, but at the time I was pretty burned out at the union, and I thought that 5 years of funding to write this book sounded pretty great. So seems naive now, but that was the thinking at the time. And so I applied to Brown's PhD programs to write a history of PUMA and the broader history of the sex worker rights movement. But in graduate school, as I stepped back to center the experiences of all people engaged in commercial sex or profiled as such, I saw that what united sexually profiled people was exposure to police. So what really started to capture my attention was sexual policing, right? Or the targeting and legal control of people's bodies and their presumed sexual activities. It was really no coincidence that I landed on the police. Just months after I started graduate school, Black Lives Matter was born in response to the murders of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Eric Garner. By the time I was studying for my exams in fall 2014, Kimberly Crenshaw and the African American Policy Forum were naming the invisibility of Black women in the rising protests against police violence and created the phrase, "say her name." So I was absolutely motivated to think about the historical relationship between police and Black women. Around the same time, an episode of Cops aired featuring the arrest of a young Black woman. She and her friend were simply walking among the crowds on Las Vegas Boulevard when they caught the attention of two police officers. This 19-year-old woman was drinking alcohol out of a bottle of iced tea, right? So in other words, she was engaging in the very common practice of underage drinking. But the officers immediately presumed that she was engaged in commercial sex. They interrogated her, they rifled through her purse, and they concluded that she was, quote, out here for all the wrong reasons. As the young woman was shackled by police, she protested, I am a human being just like everybody else. I'm not doing nothing but walking up and down, looking at the lights. So this woman really grounded my commitments as I thought about the historical relationship between police and Black women. Who has the right to exist on city streets, right? Or in other words, what are the right reasons in the imaginations of police for poor young Black women to be on city streets? And contemporary media is hyper-saturated with images of sexually profiled Black women. And police practices sustain these media representations. For example, and here's just going to throw some numbers at you. In 2019, 42% or over 40% of all people arrested for prostitution-related misdemeanors in the US were Black. And to put this number in context, right, this is the third highest proportion of Black people arrested for any FBI-defined crime. The FBI, and you'll see, so it's robbery, murder, and then prostitution and commercialized vice. The FBI wants us to understand arrest statistics as a neutral measure of crimes committed in the US. But if we think instead of arrests as a measure of police practices and priorities, then a clear picture snaps into focus, right? Gendered Blackness is a terrain on which police enact power. As I narrate in the book, across the 20th century, officers have been empowered with a huge arsenal of vague municipal and state morals laws, including disorderly conduct, vagrancy, loitering, and prostitution. And so these laws are entirely driven by police discretion. As a result, officers can legally approach any woman and arrest her for any reason, but they do not. So we must ask, right, what is the historical process by which Black women are made vulnerable to sexual policing? As I headed to the archives, I expected to write a 20th century history of sexual policing through Black women's encounters with law enforcement. So you can imagine my surprise when I went to the archives and confronted a law enforcement obsession with the presumed sexual practices of working class white and European immigrant women. As a poor white woman told an investigator in the 1930s, in my world, somebody is always getting arrested. So clearly, some sort of racial and gender shift had taken place in the police practices across the 20th century. And statistics provide some measure of this shift. Between 1932, when the FBI started to collect these statistics, in 2019, we can see that the proportion of Black people arrested on prostitution-related misdemeanors doubled, more than doubled, while white people's arrests dropped by over a third. When my story begins in the 1920s, urban authorities were primarily concerned with enforcing the sexual purity of white womanhood, right? Which meant in practice, the vigilant and violent enforcement of Jim Crow segregation. But beginning in the post-war period and accelerating in the 1970s and 1980s, the sexual policing of white women became a lower law enforcement priority. Right? Instead, Black women were increasingly seen as major threats to urban order and prosperity. By the time my story ends in the 1980s, poor and working class white women gained unprecedented freedoms from law enforcement. But Black women were and remain uniquely vulnerable to systematic arrest and spatial banishment in gentrified cities. So that's the broad narrative arc of this history, but what are the stakes, right? Why does this history matter? Sexual policing is state violence. Just one arrest triggers economic and social catastrophe in the lives of targeted women, their families, and their communities. And sexual policing legalizes and legitimizes police sexual violence, which I've written about for the Boston Review, and you can check out if you want to read more. Right? But this is all to say that this in itself is an emergency. But sexual policing is also an engine of police authority, right? Laying the groundwork for a massive expansion of police legitimacy and police power that makes cities less safe for everyone. When my book starts during the scandalous failure of prohibition, police were widely held in contempt as brutal and corrupt. They were a national joke, according to one federal report in 1931. But by the 1980s, police transformed in the eyes of white Americans from corrupt goons to urban saviors. Police departments presided over a regime of mass misdemeanor policing or broken windows policing, presenting themselves as the only solution to unlocking urban wealth and safety. And so these shifts were made possible through sexual policing. By studying the racial and gender dimensions of sexual policing, we can see how police both exploited and enforced racist and sexist hierarchies to dramatically widen the scope of their power. And in so doing, we can also illuminate the varieties of resistance to police power. So today, and here I'm just offering the book's table of contents to serve as our roadmap for this talk. I'm going to begin by crediting the Black feminist analytical framework that informs my history through a discussion of chapter 1. Next, I will focus on a crucial turning point in this history through sexual policing in 1960s Los Angeles, or chapter 3 in the book. And finally, I'll return to a discussion of the impact of this history on the expansion of police power in 1970s Boston and 1980s Atlanta, or chapters 4 and 5. Right. So first, I want to share the book's Black feminist historical framework, which I developed with the support and funding of the CSREA. Black feminist scholars, Patricia Hill Collins, Evelyn Hammonds, and Hortense Spillers, have offered analytical frameworks to understand why there were so many white women in the archive in the first few decades of the 20th century. Right? Womanhood is meaningless without racial contrasts, which we could also call racist contrasts. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, white womanhood was popularly understood as the anchor of sexual morality, right? The necessary cornerstone of a white social order constituted by the racially segregated and patriarchal home. Poor white and European immigrant women presumed to be engaging in straight, non-marital sex, and those observed in the company of men of color represented serious threats to this white social order. Black womanhood, however, was degraded as irredeemably immoral, a naturalized and hypersexualized feature of the urban sexual landscape. Black women on city streets, at labor and at leisure, did not disrupt the white moral order. Indeed, presumptions of their excessive sexuality sustained the white moral order. As late as 1964, an academic study found that, quote, the white policeman is more offended by sexual promiscuity among white people. He expects and is not annoyed by such behavior among Negroes. At the same time, however, Black feminist historians, including Cynthia Blair, Cheryl Hicks, and Kali Gross, have documented the vulnerability of Black women to police violence in the early 20th century. So how can we understand what was happening to Black communities and Black women in the early decades of the 20th century, right? When white women were the greater police priority in terms of arrest rates and white-dominated culture, even as sexually profiled Black women were still unquestionably and disproportionately vulnerable to police violence. The police enforcement of white purity was bound up with the enforcement of doubled segregation, right? Racial segregation, even in states without Jim Crow segregation laws on the books, and the political and police-driven segregation of so-called vice districts to Black neighborhoods. Police deployed their discretionary power to permit white men, right, who historically enjoyed full access throughout the city, into Black neighborhoods, while they aggressively policed white women's sociability. At the same time, police erratically and arbitrarily targeted Black women for sex offenses. As Black journalists documented throughout the 1920s, sexual policing in ideological service to pure white womanhood hardened the borders of segregation. In this era of segregationist white purity policing, Black women experienced a distinct form of state harm. And I call this harm in the book violent neglect, which is inspired by Ruth Wilson Gilmore's concept of organized abandonment. Violent police neglect did not mean occasional police lenience. On the contrary, violent police neglect rendered Black women vulnerable to heightened precarity and danger in their lives. One example I offer in the book is the story of Eva Bolden. In Pittsburgh, 5 white men broke into Eva Bolden's apartment, allegedly seeking a house of prostitution. Frightened to find 5 strange white men in her home, Mrs. Bolden grabbed a knife to defend herself. When the police came on the scene, it was Eva Bolden, not the white men, who faced legal punishment. She and her husband were both arrested for aggravated assault. So in this way, segregationist, white purity sexual policing justified the white domestic terrorism of Black homes and the criminalization of Black women's self-defense. So violent police neglect actually multiplied state and non-state violence in Black women's lives. I credit the Black feminist and sex worker activists who protested the serial murders of Black women in the 1970s and 80s, the subject of the last chapter in my book, with building this analysis that helped me to understand the violent formation of police practices before World War II. Violent police neglect endures throughout the 20th century in Black communities, right? But it also fuses with systematic police action targeting Black women. Across the 20th century, women who were once considered a natural, right, necessary, and generally accepted feature of the urban sexual landscape become reimagined as a major threat to urban prosperity and safety. And this shift played out in the context of 2 seemingly contradictory trends in the modern US. And on the one hand, the 20th century can be characterized by the gradual liberalization of laws against straight, non-marital sex. For example, it's no longer illegal for a woman to have intraracial sex with a man she's not married to, right? And this is an offense that white women were routinely arrested for through even the 1960s. But on the other hand, we also see the mounting force of a racialized regime of mass misdemeanor policing or broken windows policing. Right? And indeed, broken windows policing takes root at the height of sexual liberalization. So how can we account for this contradiction? And how do these developments map onto the tremendous increase of racialized police power? To answer this question, I want to turn to a discussion of policing in mid-century Los Angeles. Late one night in October 1961, 2 Los Angeles police officers thought that they had made a perfectly legitimate arrest when they charged Betty, a white woman, with disorderly conduct. The officers were in their radio car patrolling downtown Los Angeles when they observed Betty, quote, cruising in a manner designed to attract the attentions of men. The officers stopped to question Betty, and a search of her belongings turned up evidence of her sexual criminality, including a beer can opener and a contraceptive kit. In previous decades, this incriminating combination of a white woman carrying items associated with alcohol consumption and non-reproductive sex would have been very likely enough to yield a conviction. But in a surprising twist, the charges against Betty were dismissed by the prosecutor's office. The city's prosecutor advised the police department that his office was increasingly reluctant to enforce morals misdemeanors. And in a rare admission of error, the chastened LAPD chief admitted that it would have been wiser to have released Betty without pressing charges. Betty's case reflects an important turning point in the 20th century history of sexual policing. The gradual decriminalization of white women's straight, non-marital sexual practices. 3 years later, in April 1964, Los Angeles County Supervisor Kenneth Hahn declared an all-out war against narcotics and open prostitution in his predominantly Black district in South Los Angeles. Coordinating with the DA and the sheriff, Hahn orchestrated accelerated enforcement activities in the neighborhood. Over 100 suspects were arrested, rounded up, and loaded onto waiting buses. These two episodes illuminate the divergent racial trajectories that sexual policing will take in the US. On the one hand, we have an episode where the city's prosecutor is reluctant to enforce morals misdemeanors, right? And just a few years later, we have accelerated enforcement activities in a Black neighborhood. So how can we understand this moment of sexual liberalization and intensified morals policing? To answer this question, I'm going to discuss the causes and consequences of mid-century legal reforms. Thanks to liberal legal reforms, white women like Betty were immunized from police action, even as police officers retained the discretionary power to target Black women. And then I'm going to discuss how Black residents responded to this deepening racial inequality and morals policing. I was very surprised to learn that these changing police practices were actually directly connected to the 1965 uprising in the Black neighborhood of Watts. Okay, so how did we get there? Well, an onslaught of post-war statistics delivered alarming evidence that the erstwhile paragons of sexual virtue, middle-class white women, were increasingly having sex outside of the legal sanction of marriage. As the gap between sex laws and sex practices among otherwise respectable women was exposed, social scientists argued that morals laws created a broad class of law-abiding lawbreakers. During this period, who counted as sexually deviant, and what kinds of sexual deviance registered as a criminal offense was undergoing a significant recalculation. And this social science was grounded within a specific post-war context of deepening urban segregation, right, of white suburbanization and Black urban migration. And women's non-marital straight sex was reappraised through these visions of women's distinct racialized environments, right? The home for white women and the slum for Black women. Social scientists downgraded white women's non-marital sex as an individual and private maladjustment, right? Perhaps requiring psychoanalytic treatment, but certainly not criminal system intervention. Black women's presumed sexual practices, however, were established as the counterpoint to this new white normal, right? Representing a public, community-wide criminal tendency. Reformist lawyers responded to this trend in social science, and they launched challenges to morals laws in an effort to redraw the line that separated a law-abiding lawbreaker from a criminal. By the early 1960s, this liberal reformism gained considerable momentum in courts and legislatures. Lawmakers had to resolve a key question, right? How to prevent police officers from enforcing morals laws against law-abiding lawbreakers while still preserving police officers' power to arrest sexually suspicious people. At the heart of this tension was the question of police discretion. How to accommodate the relaxed standards of women's sexual practices while simultaneously affirming the authority of police discretion. In 1961, two California legal reforms show us how courts and legislatures were working to balance this tension. First, the Supreme Court of California struck down LA's extremely broad municipal morals ordinances in the In Bray Lane ruling. Carol Lane was a white woman described by the press as a Hollywood model, and she was at the center of this state Supreme Court challenge case. Lane had been arrested in her home after police officers watched through a window as two different men visited Miss Lane in the bedroom of her apartment. The court said that non-marital straight sex was not a crime in the California criminal code, and therefore it could not be made a crime at the city level. So this case will come back to haunt us, but local police discretion was not really at issue in this case, and it went unchallenged. Police discretion, however, was the prime question when the California legislature revised the state's vagrancy statute. This was the same statute that officers had pinned on Betty. In their reform, lawmakers struck a compromise. And I've lost my slide. They struck a compromise between restricting police officers' power to engage in status policing, right? They included a loitering provision which upheld law enforcement's discretionary authority to police public immorality. This power to police public immorality provided a race-neutral avenue to make discretionary sexual policing in Black neighborhoods lawful, right? So the question is how to restrict police from engaging in gratuitous, overbroad policing based on people's looks while still preserving their discretion to police public immorality. When the city prosecutor dismissed the charge against Betty, it was because the office anticipated the liberalization of this vagrancy statute. And the dismissal of Betty's charge shows us which women were less likely to be seen as offenders of public morality. After this legal turn, white women were granted a measure of freedom from sexual policing. These legal reforms translated into material changes in police practices, and I would be happy to talk about those changes in the Q&A. But for now, I think I'll just show you evidence of the impact of these legal reforms. Los Angeles police arrest statistics for the years between 1954 and 1963 show us an acceleration in the racial inequality in sexual policing. Right? White women's prostitution-related arrests drop by 22%, while Black women's arrests rise by 23%. One Hollywood sheriff explained that today's liberal judicial interpretations shielded white women from legal punishment. But the liberal judicial interpretations had ominous consequences for Black women who lived in neighborhoods that were policed as zones of vice. As Black refugees migrated to post-war Los Angeles, a new generation of Black residents confronted an enduring 20th century condition, right? The simultaneous violent police neglect and violent police action in their neighborhoods. As in earlier decades, violent neglect was especially visible in the discretionary enforcement of morals laws. To Black residents of Los Angeles, sexual policing in their neighborhood was a flagrant example of police discrimination. But their outrage was compounded by white women's very conspicuous recent immunity from police action. As one columnist wrote in a local Black newspaper, Caucasian prostitutes are surely in business in Caucasian neighborhoods, but, right, he protested, white women are now walking down streets free from the legal punishment that targeted Black women. I wonder, he asked, can the police explain why? So by the early 1960s, there's multiple and competing forms of Black protests that are arising in Los Angeles to challenge this racist inequity in morals enforcement. But I just want to offer you one example, which illustrates how Black frustrations with sexual policing were coming to a boil by the mid-1960s. So let's return to April 1964, when County Supervisor Kenneth Hahn launched his all-out war against narcotics and open prostitution in South Los Angeles. Morals crackdowns in Black neighborhoods were not new to Black residents, but in the pitched intensity of the early 1960s, and as racial inequality and sexual policing deepened, this all-out war triggered the anger of many Black residents. The weekend of an all-out war coincided with multiple violent confrontations between police and Black residents. When a Black activist delivered his response to the weekend battles at a City Hall press conference, the racial inequality of morals enforcement was the very first grievance he listed. The climate of today is an explosive one. The community knows that vice, prostitution, and gambling are participated in by other communities which are overlooked by the police. Right, so they respond explosively when the vice squad raids Central Los Angeles. In the many violent confrontations between police and Black residents that punctuated the months leading up to the Watts uprising, the racially unequal enforcement of morals laws was a powerful engine of Black protest. After the Watts uprising, Los Angeles authorities doubled down on the aggressive, racialized morals policing that had triggered Black anger in the first place. And these officials pointed to In Ray Lane and liberalizing morals laws as a key source of racial disorder. In the fall of 1965, just weeks after Watts, one Los Angeles County supervisor floated a proposal to place a Decency Amendment on the statewide ballot, which would, quote, restore local determination over laws on crimes which were taken away in 1961 by the In Ray Lane ruling. The Los Angeles District Attorney endorsed this amendment, arguing that the recent riots have supplied the proof that Los Angeles needed a return to the law as it was prior to the Carol Lane decision. By linking Watts with a call for tougher morals laws, the DA made it clear that white women's sexual practices were no longer considered a criminal threat to the white social order. Instead, strict morals policing was necessary to restrain and control Black neighborhoods. And when Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as governor of California in 1967, reversing In Ray Lane was the first item on his crime agenda for the state. In Los Angeles, the freshly recalibrated racist logics of sexual policing consolidated around the argument that mass morals misdemeanor arrests in Black neighborhoods were an important way to contain Black violence specifically and Black people generally. This logic would become foundational for the theory of broken windows policing, right? The argument that aggressively policing low-level, nonviolent misdemeanors would prevent more serious crimes, violent crimes, help to secure public order and urban prosperity. So LA was an enormously influential seedbed of post-war police practices, but it's just one city, right? And it sort of begs the question, what's happening in other cities? So in my research, I turned to Boston and Atlanta because I wanted to know how two very racially and regionally distinct cities converged on the same logic of broken windows policing and what that meant for the racist and sexist formation of police power and space in these cities. So I'm going to smush the two cities together to kind of sum up what happens next in the book, but I'll be happy to talk about the distinct histories of each city if folks are curious in the Q&A. So beginning in the post-war years and accelerating in the 60s and 70s, cities were reeling from white capital divestment as white property and business owners decamped to the suburbs. The property values and tax base of urban space became a powerful driver of post-war sexual policing. The so-called urban crisis was, in fact, a crisis for Black women. Poor and working class white women now moved relatively freely through urban space. And instead, in these distinct urban contexts, hyper-visible sexually profiled Black women were singled out as criminal agents of urban disorder, violence, and economic decline. Politicians, police leaders, and business elites claimed that Black women had to be cleared off of city streets in order to revitalize deteriorating cities. Right, and here we have one business leader in Atlanta saying that Atlanta can't be an easy city or seen as easy on Black prostitutes. But the legal liberalism of the 60s that we saw in action in Los Angeles had culminated with a Supreme Court ruling in 1972 that struck down status policing, or policing based on people's looks. Right, so how could urban authorities legally accomplish their task of mass clearance of Black women off city streets? One of the central goals of broken windows policing was to develop the legal and political logics to resurrect status policing. And many of these early battles to re-legalize discretionary status policing were first tested on sexually profiled Black women. Right, and all these headlines that you see on these slides are referring to new innovations like loitering with intent to commit prostitution laws and urban banishment orders. These laws were then later expanded to target presumed gang members, people experiencing homelessness, and a large roster of so-called disorderly people. So this history reveals that sexual policing was the laboratory in which experimental carceral policies were first tested. And these policies helped to put police at the center of urban planning and policy making. And this was all done in service to what was called in an Atlanta public-private report on policing in the city, the shared vision, right, of white reclamation of urban space by business leaders and real estate developers, right, fully driven by mass misdemeanor policing. So what can we learn from this history? Right. Throughout the research process, I would constantly heard some variation on the theme that sexual policing was just the way it's always been, right? There's that refrain of the oldest profession, and sexual policing itself is just as sort of an unchanging constant, right, in urban American life. For sure, historians of police have to reckon intellectually, politically, and emotionally reckon with what often feels like the unceasing sameness of police violence. But we ignore what changed in the history of sexual policing at our own peril. Right? Sexual policing is governance by other means. Sexual policing does political work. And to understand the work it's doing, we need to attend to how the priorities and practices of sexual policing have changed over time. Across the 20th century, through sexual policing, officers redrew the borders of lawful white womanhood and the spatial borders of whiteness itself. Police departments seized unprecedented authority in urban policymaking, and sexual policing catalyzed visionary forms of Black resistance against police predation and violent neglect. Looking for change in the past also signals our faith that change can be made in the future. Okay. In her essay, Venus in Two Acts, Saidiya Hartman defines the writing of the history of the present as writing the incomplete project of freedom. So this is as much about narrating the past as it is about attending to our unwritten future. Police power is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. It is human-made and is political, and that makes it fragile. Modern police departments rose to power through sexual policing, and denying their authority over women's bodies is a crucial next step in unmaking police power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was wonderful. Whew. Wow, so much has happened since you were thinking that through. It was, remember our conversations about what cities and how to connect them, and you've brought it together so wonderfully. It's really wonderful. I mean, this really critical through line, right, of the broader, the city specific elements, but the broader framework and the continuities of these historical shifts from whiteness and working class sort of women's sexual policing to the ways in which that transforms on Black women's bodies, but sort of why they do, right? And of course, when I say favorite, I say that not like favorite, favorite, happy favorite. But one of my favorite things is really the profound insights you've made about, reframing what broken windows policing has really been about, right? And how early it starts, and how flexible it is, right, as mass misdemeanor, right, and how it requires framing Black people in a particular way across the board. It's not, the presumption, I think, even for people who were against broken windows, was that there was somehow sort of bad behavior going on, right, that was being targeted, intensively, but that there was actually something going on. Well, what your framework really does is make that kind of argument far less coherent, right? Because it just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, thank you so much for that talk. I'm going to ask a couple of questions to get us started, because I know people are taking notes and trying to figure out, any number of things they're going to want to talk about. But I want to go back to your beginning, which is how important it is for Black feminist and sex worker activists, who we didn't hear that much from after the very beginning, how these two communities of women, really taught you so much about this project, and sort of what did they each teach you the most, and why?
Yeah, thank you. And it is true, and this was also something I remember we were working on when I was working on the dissertation, right, was what role women's voices would play in the manuscript, right? And I definitely landed on wanting to shine a light on police practices, really expose what is happening with policing. I was also super inspired by Laura Briggs, who sort of insists on returning a measure of privacy, right, to women whose lives have been so dominated by intrusive and carceral interrogations.
Right.
But at the same time, right, I fully recognize that so much of the expertise, so much of the vision, what we know about police comes from activists who are, those who are most directly impacted, right? And those who are most routinely targeted by police are experts of police practices.
Right.
So I think one of the most urgent lessons, well, there's a lot. So one thing I do want to name, though, is particularly in the final chapter, when I look at competing feminist mobilizations to protest the serial murders of Black women. So there's this rising reign of terror and rising numbers of serial murders of Black women in cities across the US during the 1970s and 1980s. In Boston, this is really one of the first major mobilizations for Barbara Smith and the Combahee River Collective to sort of bring a Black feminist analysis in an overwhelmingly patriarchal, Black and patriarchal space, saying that, the only way that Black women can be safe amid this terror this non-state terror is, to stay at home, as if, right, home is assuming that home, a patriarchal home at that, is a safe space for Black women, right? So they really insist on reckoning with both the ways in which race and gender compound, right, to make Black women in Boston in the 1970s so vulnerable to this violence. But we also have other groups of, so Black feminists are really doing a lot of this work, but interrogating police for a lot of reasons I talk about in that book is not sort of a central component of what the Combahee River Collective is doing, either in their own theorizing or the coalitions that they're bridging across Boston at this time. But there are other mobilizations as well, particularly coming out of the anti-capitalist and multiracial Wages for Housework Network, which is an international network of socialist feminists. And I focus in particular on the work of Margaret Prescott, who was a Wages for Housework affiliate, an activist, a representative for Prostitutes Organization of New York, or PONY. But she actually later moves to LA in the mid-1980s, when LA is when Black communities in LA are experiencing the terror of serial murder. And she forms a coalition called Black Coalition Fighting Back Serial Murders. She's the one, right, who develops this analysis that the ways that police are engaging in broken windows policing actually makes Black women less safe. And, she sort of, I hear her again and again in contemporary uprisings, right, in contemporary language, protesting police violence. Today, she started by saying, count women's lives, all women's lives count, right, which has resonates so strongly for me with Black Lives Matter. She also is sort of the early visionary for defund. She's arguing that by taking in a period of economic austerity, cutting budgets, slashing social welfare resources, and giving them to the police to engage in broken windows policing, renders Black women uniquely vulnerable to harm. And she makes an argument that this funding should actually be redistributed to education, to healthcare, to social services, right? So she's, on the ground doing this work and advancing this analysis that I think is still very much, relevant and resonating today.
Yeah, no, I mean, the points of parallel and continuity, right, which are not the same thing, but are related, is really extraordinary. On so many levels. So I have two questions that are kind of all tangled up together, but one is, Daniel McGuire's book, On the Dark End of the Street, really connects the emergence of the civil rights movement to, the public sexual vulnerabilities of Black women who were, as we know throughout history since enslavement, being subjected to levels of sexual violence as one of the ways in which racial violence was being enacted on the community as a whole. And, so this sort of escalation, or the trigger points of a set of circumstances that McGuire argues were pivotal to sort of, it's not the point of origin, right? That's not enough, because that wouldn't be that small of a point of origin ultimately for such a big thing. It was one of the triggers for organizing the civil rights movement. And then, if you think about, what goes on with broken windows policing and what goes on later, right, and what you connect to Say Her Name, and also what Phil Goff has argued, that a lot of this violent policing really does produce unarticulated sexual violence against Black women at the hands of the police, right? Which is, again, a really key feature of the Black Lives Matter movement. Can you draw some more connections there and share with us what you think about how those things might be tethered? Because again, in both cases, it seems as if the fundamental framework is erasure and silence, right? Even within the movements of resistance in terms of the national conversation.
Yeah, and I think as I was listening to you talk, on the one hand, um, with the activisms that I trace in this book, I'm trying to trace this genealogy of Black feminist thought, right?
Mhm.
And at the same time, I think we can also think of this as a genealogy of state violence as well, in the ways that it sort of morphs and yet endures in different forms and in distinct registers. Um, One thing I will quickly say, sorry, I have a bunch of bullet points all kind of crowding in my brain trying to get through. One thing I will say is that I think what's really important to understand with police sexual violence is that it's legal, right? Is that it's not only fully a legalized police practice, it's baked into and expected of in a repertoire of police tools, right? And so this is the same way that I'm always reminding my students the ways in which, to your point, right? Always reminding my students the ways in which the legal regime of enslavement was legal, right? That it was not only legalized, but and then incentivized through its legal structure, the sexual assault of enslaved women, right? And in much the same way, right, sexual policing, the mandate to engage, to target women, and when I talk in the contemporary register, right, I'm speaking is fully inclusive of cis women, trans women, anyone who identifies as a woman, right? So the police mandate to target women's bodies based on their presumed sexual practices writes in a repertoire of sexual assault, whether it's to collect evidence, or whether it's to collect evidence, whether it's to simply establish police authority. Penetration, police penetrative sex is legal in most states, right, for police officers. And so it builds in a series of.
Did you say that penetrative sex in the act of arresting people is legal? Okay, you got to stop whatever you were saying and you got to tell us a little bit more about that, because that just, what's the rationale?
So
And
I think
most, I mean, go ahead, sorry, I'm just so flabbergasted.
yes. So Michigan, I believe in 2017, now I'm going to pull out my book to get the details. So in 2017, Michigan, I believe, banned penetrative sex. But in other states, like in in Alaska, when they were trying to recently ban penetrative sex, the Anchorage Police Department mobilized to quash this bill because it would, it would prevent police from it would prevent police from fully having the resources, the access that they needed in order to do their work, right? To do their public safety work. So sexual contact is legal in, I believe, every state. I haven't found a state where it's not. Penetrative sex is contested in some states, right? So that's absolutely right, and this means that for the police, this is a form of evidence gathering. But of course, for the women who don't realize that the men that they are engaging in commercial sex with are undercover cops, this is 100% experienced as sexual assault. A lot of this, I think, comes from the very carefully orchestrated across the 20th century, very carefully orchestrated rebranding of police as performing a public service and public safety service, right? Mm-hmm. And what I argue in the book, right, is that particularly with the help of white feminists in the 80s and 90s, sexual policing gets reframed as feminist, right, and as uniquely protective of women. And this totally harkens back to the early 20th century when the white purity policing was framed as a form of protection, right, for poor and working class white and European immigrant women, right? And so you can see the ways in which, through the logic, through the argument that policing performs a protective service for women, for white women in particular, this sexual violence gets laundered into a public safety service, which totally obscures the racist and sexist logics that are driving these kinds of sex law enforcement practices.
Yeah, I see. Whoa. Yeah, that's pretty, that's really staggering. I don't know how I missed that earlier. But let me go back to your question about your discussion a little bit about the ways in which this practice now expands to include a broader, more visible element of women's communities, in particular trans women. So what are the lessons that this history of police violence against women in general, what can they tell us about, or how do they relate to police and other violence against trans women today?
So, I think the first thing that we see, right, by focusing on the ways in which cisgendered women's presumed straight sexual practices are targeted, we've learned first, right, that and this goes back to Kathy Cohen's argument, right, that heterosexuality, right, is the normative heterosexuality is not available for everyone. Just so we can see it, the distinct ways in which legal normative heterosexuality is like totally racialized, right, and has a very specific form of enforcement on the ground. But for trans women in particular, right, a lot of the decriminalization activism that we're seeing now is fully driven by trans activists and trans sex workers and their allies, because trans women in particular are experiencing on the ground the ways in which their existence on city streets is made criminal, right, is criminalized by police. So a key lesson that we can learn, right, is the ways in which is why and how, right, people are denied the right to exist on city streets based on gender and sexual presentation, right, or presumed gender and sexual presentation. We have, sort of visionary trans activists saying, that because the police think that we do not exist on city streets, therefore, right, there's nothing to do with us but arrest us. The quote is better it's in the Boston Review article. It's also in the book. But another really important lesson that we see is that, here in the state of Texas, where I am, we're seeing, every year unprecedented new rising numbers of trans women who've been murdered. And we're also seeing that in nationwide, right? Rising numbers of violence targeting, non-state violence targeting trans women. And here too, again, we can see it's a really chilling parallel to the serial murders of Black women in the 70s and 80s, where we can see once again the ways in which police neglect, like this toxic combination of both police neglect and police hostility, renders trans women multiply vulnerable to both state and non-state violence.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that came up when you were at Brown was this question of the archive and what to do with police records and how to read them, how to understand them as documents that would help illuminate this counter reading of their practices. And at one point, you talk about stitching together archival fragments, right, in this particular way. Can you say more about that? Because, this is an important problem, right? We need to know things that are not easy to simply reflect based on any given archive, and yet we need to know how to create in a truthful, ethical, and responsible way, but also accurate, what has been going on. So how did you stitch together archival fragments, and why was that necessary?
Yeah, so the state really does not, the police records in general, police and prison records in general are restricted or destroyed. These are not records the state wants to keep of itself. Kelly Lytle Hernandez is doing amazing work recovering and digitizing LAPD records, but that's, the volume that she's collecting, right, only speaks to the volume that we're missing as well, if not more, right? So it was really, really hard to gain access to, there's of course the records that the state will allow access to, statistics, right? So I really had to figure out early on how I was going to understand statistics, because that was sort of the only thing that the state would give us. And that's really not even consistently offered, right? So I had to understand, how to make use of this really kind of, imperfect data. But what I really wanted, and what I was really trying to find was an understanding of what on the ground sexual policing looked and felt like, how it was experienced, why it was, what would initiate an interrogation, why, what did that look like? Even if we can't trust, right, the police in their own words, I want to know how they are presenting and understanding these encounters. And that was really pretty hard to find. I think a lot of it, the stitching together was really just meant being a very, very persistent and kind, but persistent and probably annoying presence in the lives of any archivist who seemed in any way open to my project. And so it was really, it was a matter of just kind of badgering archivists. There's one archive that I wanted to just, that for me really highlights the ways in which state neglect and active state destruction can combine to sometimes surprisingly make records available. So while I was in Boston, I had seen listed the existence of Boston Municipal Court records for women's probation. And I had hoped that might have some narrative details about the everyday experience and texture of sexual policing. I found this archivist co-conspirator who worked for she was the archivist for the state Supreme Court in Massachusetts, but she was also co-creator of the History Project, which is the queer archive in Boston, the community-based queer archive. And so I felt okay persisting and constantly being in her life and a recurring presence in her inbox. I kept asking about these probation records over and over and over again over a series of years. And she finally, she said, "Oh, I think those have been destroyed. They've been marked for destruction." And that, but there was no proof, and I really needed to see the paper shredding. I needed to see bags of shredded paper to really believe that it had been destroyed. And I was doing anything I could. I went to the probate court, which I fully realize is a totally different thing, but I was like, "Hello, clerk of the probate court. I'm looking for these boxes." And actually it was the probate guy who was like, "Well, there is this warehouse in the suburbs." And so I went back to my co-conspirator archivist and I was like, "What about this warehouse? I'll rent a car. Let's just go." And then so she finally relented, went to the warehouse, and she was like, "Oh, you know what? They were marked for destruction, but someone forgot to destroy them." Which for me, there's no proof of this, but for me, this, as a paranoid, just whatever gender historian, I'm like, this shows me that women's records are both considered destructible, necessary or not needed. They can be destroyed, but there's also so much neglect, people just forget or don't even care about these women's records. So I spent just a week photographing everything I could in these boxes before she had to take them away. So the most important thing that I'll say about stitching together, what those archives actually proved, was that there was a very clear practice in place of banishment orders, which were attached to women's arrests in Boston, in the city of Boston, it was an ongoing practice from the 1920s to the 1980s. These records spanned the 20th century. But the banishment orders, when you look at, so they're attached to as an arrest as a condition. You won't go to jail if you honor these banishment orders. So if women were seen in a certain part of the city or even seen in the city itself, they would be arrested on site. And like I said, these banishment orders were in place in the 20s. There's a white woman with tattoos in 1928, and they're like, oh, she's got to get out of Boston. We can't have that in Boston. But these banishment orders become a systematic, they're rare in the earlier period, but by the 60s and 70s, there's more and more of these banishment orders. They're called floaters, being attached to women's arrest rates, to women's arrests. And you can 100% see what's happening, that white women are being told to go back to their mother, right? Whereas Black women are being told to go back where they came from, right? And or to not set foot in a certain part of the city, right? And the numbers for Black women's banishment orders get increased. And so the ways in which, the legal mechanisms in which Black women are banished, beginning in that urban crisis period, becomes a real through line in the book. And if those archives had actually been destroyed, instead of just marked for destruction and forgotten, we wouldn't really know that piece.
Yeah, I mean, what are the grounds for even deciding they should be destroyed? Who makes that kind of a decision and why? I mean, in this era, there's so much technology to actually copy and retain electronic versions. There's really no reason to get rid of it unless, as you said, there this crazy combination of lack of interest and sort of violent disregard, and also the idea that this couldn't really tell us anything important about the police. Wow, that's incredible. Did you gather like friends to go take pictures of because 1 week doesn't seem like enough time for one person. I'm sure you were frantic about it.
And I had to be really secretive about it because the archivist didn't know if I was allowed access to them. She did know, and I technically wasn't. So, it was just kind of like I wasn't there when I went to, so I just kind of went to her office, and I just sort of like took pictures for 8 hours straight for a few days straight.
Wow.
So yeah, and so I'm very happy now to share the records I have, the photos I have, because I don't know what's happened to them since, and because I wasn't even supposed to have access to them in the first place.
Right. I mean, this is so important, and I know it's not directly about your book, but it is about your book, right? It's what kind of argument can you make? What kinds of patterns can be discerned if we don't have access to this kind of information? And as we know, statistics don't tell us this. Statistics are very helpful for some things, but of course it depends on what you're measuring and why. But this could be, if the statistics were about this information, right, that would be wholly different, but that's not what gets gathered. So when people think, oh, archives are boring or history is boring, it's like, no, it's actually this amazing sort of dramatic kind of act of, in the right hands, of sort of telling stories that can't otherwise be told at all. Just remarkable. Let me ask one more question, and then I have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I want to encourage those of you who are here to throw in a couple of questions for Anne before too long, because we're not here too much longer, and I want to make sure everyone's thoughts or just comments get included. Over the course of the 20th century, many of the cities that you're dealing with, Boston, LA, Atlanta, but especially Atlanta, become eventually led by, Black police chiefs, and in some cases, women police chiefs. I'm thinking of, Baltimore and other places, Black queer police chiefs, female. I'm like, they've got every possible, revision of the standard police chief. And yet, these kinds of practices are not necessarily changing in any significant way. So what do you make of this kind of process by which, the same constituency, right, that is now being understood as the leader of this kind of policing institution can sort of preside over a set of practices that are doing the same kind of work. And historically in Atlanta, right, this relates to the broken windows, sort of black-led city and its role in that. How, what do we make of that? How do we respond to that? Because I think it does make it a lot harder for many people who think in very sort of limited ways and sort of personal ways about race and racism and sexism. But what do you make of it, and what might you think we should do about that problem?
So two things. I'll try to be brief for both so we can get to the Q&A. But, I do look at what is happening after, in the late 1960s, as there's more and more demands from certain segments of, sort of the Black mobilization for more Black police officers, for example, right? And there are ways in which Black police officers in the 60s, particularly, so Black police officers in the 60s are immediately assigned to vice units, right? Because it's understood, right, that if vice is racialized as Black crime, then Black cops are seen as sort of the best, liaisons for that kind of community-facing work. And, Black police themselves, there's a moment I talk about in Boston where there's an all-Black unit that's very briefly formed called the Soul Patrol. And they're very clear that, prostitution policing is not their priority. They don't engage in it, right? The Soul Patrol is later disbanded when the white police union forces them to integrate. But Black police officers in this moment don't really see sex policing as necessary, as a priority. For them, it's violent and a distraction, right? It leaves police vulnerable to corruption and brutality, and it doesn't serve the community, which is why they wanted to become cops in the first place. But Black officers are being, in larger numbers, are being brought into police departments at the very moment that we see broken windows policing consolidating and a systematic regime targeting Black neighborhoods. And I talk about why that is and how sex policing is sort of at the center of these struggles. But I think overall, that key lesson, right, is that if we understand policing to be inherently a form of state violence, then that violence cannot be reformed away. Including Black police officers into departments whose structures they don't control will not actually help to root out, right, the sort of foundational violence that is that drives law enforcement logics and practices on this land. So that's sort of the representation of false trap of representation piece. But then the question is, well, what happens once, Black police officers become the leaders, like the chiefs, right, of these police departments, as in the case of Reggie Eves in Atlanta, appointed by the first mayor of a large Black Southern city, Maynard Jackson. Right. And in that case, then you start to see that police departments themselves are totally enmeshed in the political urban context in which they're located. And Maynard Jackson and Reggie Eves, as sort of city and police chief together, they were really committed to downgrading sexual policing as a priority. They were really committed to downgrading the sort of public order enforcement. Because their resources were strapped for a few other reasons, but also because they wanted to, focus on actually trying to prevent violent crimes in Black neighborhoods. And they both failed to do that. We could argue because policing itself does not meaningfully prevent violence, it produces it, but also because the white capital class essentially went on strike, right? They threatened to withdraw from the city en masse if their demands were not met. And so most of the Atlanta chapter is tracking this powerful mobilization of business leaders and of white business leaders in Atlanta who keep pushing police to meet their agenda, which is a fully broken windows agenda, all about the making white tourists, white homeowners, and white capital feel safe, right? And it's all about their perceptions of safety in the city. They're very clear that they think that the city has become too black. Like they're extremely explicit about that. And you can actually see, right, how between 1973, when this coalition of business leaders, what they do is put out major recommendations that tend to get adopted in Atlanta. In 1973, all of their recommendations are about infrastructure, transportation, the MARTA. But by 1986, it's fully about expanding carceral capacity, centering police in a program as the only solution, right, for Atlanta's for Atlanta's economic prospects, right? So they molded this political context that Maynard Jackson and then Andy Young, his successor, and then Maynard Jackson again, had to reckon with, right, if they wanted to actually be able to do anything, right, in the city. The holders, right, of the capital insisted on it. There's some contingencies, but that's really sort of the pressures that even in an early sort of reformist moment to try to reshape what policing means in the city, was unable to meet the overpowering dominance of capital. I think you're muted.
I forgot I was muted. I was listening so closely. It's amazing how much sexual violence drops off of the public radar in terms of, reporting crime, right? We report every crime, but that unless it's some sort of extreme form of sort of, sexual slavery, right? Which we get a very dramatic story about. But the regularity of not only police violence in this category, but in general against women just doesn't make the news. It doesn't resonate. We have one question. I honestly not sure I understand what it's supposed to be implying. Do you see it? Can you see it in the? Do you have a comment about this? But you want me to read it, or do you want to ask the person to say more?
Yeah, I see it's a question about reassessing and redefining rape shield laws. So I'd love to hear more about that. And while we wait, I can keep talking to your earlier question, right, about when you were astonished that
penetrative sex was
yes.
a policing tool. I'm like,
right.
Yeah, I mean,
so it's and actually another, so there's more we could go on. If police are in the process of engaging in sexual policing, that counts as consent, right? For any woman that they're engaging with. This, I believe, is true in 30 states, something like that. But even when it's not legal, police sexual violence is the second most reported form of police violence, and that is likely an undercounting.
Exactly.
Right? So,
and it's never talked about.
And it's not enough, and absolutely not, especially when we understand, we learn from, there are so many gender and sexuality scholars, particularly of war, who fully recognize that sexual assault is a crucial way to establish authority, right? And dominance. And so this is, sexual policing, there's researchers in the book who recognize and targeted women themselves who recognize that sexual policing, why do police jealously guard this power,
Yeah.
which they have said so often is not, is a waste of resources. Even police themselves will say, I don't want to have to do this. Why do they jealously hold on to this power? Because it's such a crucial way for them to establish dominance and authority.
Right. And, even in the context of Black feminist movements, particularly Crenshaw's effort to, say her name, quote unquote, those are cases that are not about sexual violence, right? Again, from the hands of the police. They're more traditional kinds of what we expect the media to describe. Being pulled, Sandra Bland, right? Being pulled over, or someone being shot, a woman being shot. But the question, the bulk of this, say her name, right, is actually in the category of sexual violence. And so how might we think about making more visible the content of these practices? I mean, a body cam is probably not going to reveal this properly for all kinds of reasons, even though they have the legal right, which is just really staggering. But I think, I think in terms of a Black feminist intervention, right, on this particular point, this seems to me to be a very important place to not only continue the rewriting of broken windows, but to understand this weaponry of harassment as, as a real act of gendered sexual violence that has not, it has not made adequate public traction, in any way.
And I do want to name Andrea Ritchie and Miriam Kaba, who are doing extremely important work, spotlighting this violence. And I do see now that there's an elaboration on the rape shield law question. So I will just also quickly name, right? So there are some laws, like going back to the Reconstruction era laws, there are some codes in different state and federal statutes that would allow people to sue state workers, right, for discriminatory treatment. Section 1983 is the one that I have in mind. I've only done a little bit of research on this, but this runs up against these sort of legal codes, run up against the context, right, in which holding police to account is playing out, particularly in the courts and in, public discourse, where we have this, we really need to bring back some of that energy from the 20s and the 30s, where, police were not so unassailable, right? And police were not so immune, right?
They really built a hell of a campaign. Right, Matt. Yeah, they're public workers. They're not guardians of the universe who have just dropped from high. Go ahead. Sorry, I just was all worked up.
Yeah, so that protects them a lot, right? It's such an uphill battle. In the courts, at least, it's an uphill battle for women to win. And of course, police are targeting and predating those who are most vulnerable, right? Who have the least access to these to resources to fight back, right? Which is why Andrea Ritchie and Miriam Kaba's work is so important. But also it just showcases it's a huge uphill battle, right? To even hold police to account. And when police like Daniel Holtzclaw do get held accountable, held to account, then we really have to ask, it's not a structural form of accountability, right? It's an exception, right? And then of course the justice simply means the perpetuation of incarceration as seen as a form of repair and justice. So it's so I don't know if that really answers the rape shield question, but that's sort of how I was sort of riffing.
No, I think that's helpful. I'm glad there was further clarification. Well, this is incredibly important, and there's so many things that we need to sort of fold in to bring these historical forms of various forms of state, policing and violence into the contemporary moment. And we need much more activist engagement among the public on these elements, right? It's, gendered issues, women's issues, using that term broadly, are not separate issues, right? They're, as you've shown us, just absolutely at the center of all of the key categories that we're dealing with. You know, I'm just so excited about this book. I'm so glad it turned out so well. And I know people are here because they've probably either already read it or going to get it, but here's the cool cover, which I'm going to share very quickly. We were discussing covers when we started. You know, we're just at Brown super thrilled and proud of you and excited. And I hope we get to see you again and keep doing this amazing work, and let us know when your next book is around, or next article. We'd love to hear all about it.
Cool. Thank you so much, Tricia. It's so wonderful. Really lovely homecoming. Thanks to everyone who's listening in. And yeah, let's stay connected. Wishing everyone a very, very relaxing summer, because y'all have earned it.
May that happen to everyone here. Stay healthy, stay, you know, as up-spirited as you can. You know, we just got to keep our spirit high and keep it moving. You know, just don't let it all bring us down. Do the best we can. That's all I can say. But Anne, come see us, and thanks everyone for joining us. It was really a pleasure to have you, and thanks to everyone at CSREA as always, and to our captioner and to Media Services who are who've kept us connected for 2.5 years. All right, everybody, have a great afternoon.